Hi everyone, and thank you for joining. This will be a very interesting discussion. Let's do a quick round of introduction. I'm GregerWikstrand. I'm an architect based in Sweden, and I'm joining from home today.
Yep, so my name's Ethar. I'm Director and Chief Architect of Excelsis Limited, so we help a lot of organizations with their, if you like, transition towards more agile and lean ways of working. And I'm joining you from a hotel in Oxfordshire in the UK today. So.
Wow, hotel. I wish I was in a hotel. I'm Tom Cagley. I am the Vice President of Consulting for DCG Software Value. We help people with Agile too. And if I sound like I'm mumbling.
So we're having a little bit of lag from Tom.
Yeah.
Casimir?
Yes, Casimir Artmann here in Linköping, Sweden. Work as an enterprise architect for Society Capgemini Group.
Okay, let's go.
Greger, you and we talked about theory of contracts a few weeks ago, and the findings from the Nobel Prize winners this year. A few days after we talked, I got a letter from a friend of mine with a contract he was going to sign, and I was astonished by the findings and the issues in that contract that was very relevant for what the Nobel Prize winner said. When we talk about contracts between companies, is this a very common issue that the contracts are badly written?
Well, obviously, most contracts are good enough that companies keep working together and don't end up in court. But I think that there is a path, there is a hard and arduous path where the contract is kind of renegotiated and reinterpreted often and all the time, because it does have some flaws.
I think one of the issues that people have to deal with contracts is that contracts are a tool because the two parties have lack of trust. And because there's lack of trust, one side will attempt to exert their will on the other. And having grown up in a family of lawyers, I would suspect that that's the goal of most lawyers.
Yeah, I certainly. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. So yeah, certainly I think that in a way I kind of agree with Thomas' position on this, because contracts are a negotiation exercise, and you typically attempt, as contract theory dictates, if you like, to find the sweet spot between the buyer's attempt to gain its advantage and the seller's attempt to gain its advantage. So there's a sweet spot between the two, and certainly when you look at contract theory, especially from the mathematical perspective, it's always attempts to optimize the position between those two competing, if you like, forces. So it's interesting to kind of see it, and I've certainly seen contracts in my time which appear to be hodgepodges and mixtures, if you like, of other contracts where they've not really wanted to get lawyers involved. So there is a spectrum, certainly in my experience, of people and organizations who try to gain that advantage with sometimes quite illegitimate means, dare I say. So yes, absolutely. So I think that there's certainly a lot of commonality there, absolutely.
So I don't know if this was a bad example I got hand of, but it was very sparsely written about what should be done. Their under parts were very, very detailed. There were no obligations from either side, and those obligations were probably not according to regulations in Sweden. Probably they have taken an international contract and tried to apply it in Sweden.
Well, Casimir, why do you think that happens? What is it that drives organizations to actually make that mistake? And I think all four of us would recognize that a hodgepodge contract or a contract without obligations is going to be a trouble. I mean, I could see if they didn't know exactly where they wanted to end up. I mean, let's face it, it's very difficult to predict the future. However, without obligations and in a hodgepodge, that goes to court, in my estimation. Somebody's going to take that at some point. Why do you think they went down that path? What drove them there?
I think that in this case, it's the skills from both parties. I think that is why I got it from my friend. And I recommended him not to say yes to this contract.
I can imagine you did.
So I was thinking, you know, the first negotiation skills course training I took, they said, you know, don't be too good at negotiation, because if you win, you will end up with a deal that the other party will hate, and you can't, you'll not be able to execute on it.
Well, I guess it's possible. Obviously, you know, Ethar pointed out that we were looking for a sweet spot at the beginning. But that sweet spot generally isn't a single point than that. And because it's broad, you know, the question then becomes, in your negotiations, which way are you going to push that? Is there any fundamental rule in that discussion that says we want to be win-win? Or is it truly, because it is a negotiation, more of a win, not lose too badly scenario?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid question. I mean, this probably ties in quite nicely onto the idea of vanity metrics as well, because what you often find is that organizations may not value the same things in the same way. So the typical supplier or vendor relationship with most companies often revolves around them getting cash for as much of the stuff as possible, whilst not necessarily satisfying the end-to-end goal of the client themselves. And where there's this misalignment, there is the lack of trust, or there's a lack of precisely alignment of value, I think. And that consequently means that with companies who negotiate in two different directions, if you like, you will get situations where some people will either attempt to trade off something really important for something the client doesn't consider as important, or the vice versa may be true, where they may decide to give on one variable, if you like, to the client, so the client considers it important. Okay, you can have that, but by the same token, take more of another variable. So it's the old kind of, if I have a cake and I don't like the cherries, and it's a Black Forest Gatto, I want just the cream. So it's a pretty classic sort of formula in a way, but actually that's quite an important one to try and solve, because when you get to a position where companies are not aligned at all, and they have been almost pulled under the thumb or bullied into their position, you're absolutely right, Tom. You'll get a situation where they will hate it, and we in the UK certainly saw that with alleged, if you like, bullying or aggressive negotiation tactics from some supermarkets against small-scale suppliers. So you do see this appear, and where people haven't been trained effectively in negotiation, it can be very difficult for them to understand what they actually offer that they can trade off. That's not so important for them, but might be important for the client. And I think that there's certainly a definite impact from that perspective. So yeah.
So it's kind of what 1 month of negotiation and 12 years of execution on the contract, if you see what I mean.
Well, yeah, precisely, and that can actually be a massive problem, as you can imagine. So they're kind of kicking themselves and making this one-word change somewhere down the line. And yeah, I mean, so the idea of vanity metrics for me is a prime example of that, because when you appoint someone to say, do your social media optimization, if you like, they'll often do search engine optimizing, but that doesn't necessarily convert into sales. And the key point with that is that then gives you a vendor who doesn't themselves value you converting everything. They value the money they get for optimizing, or just even optimizing your own website or your website for you. And that gives them some value, but actually that in itself isn't valuable for the client necessarily. So, yeah.
It's like buying Twitter followers. It's
yeah, precisely. Very, very good example. Absolutely, precisely.
It doesn't give you any new friends, does it?
No, absolutely. And the quality of the conversation you get from plain walls tends to get quite dull after a while.
If you get any.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
So what's the business equivalent to buying Twitter followers?
Oh God, there's so many of those. I mean, certainly for me, the way procurement is done with one example, if I was to present an example for yourself, because often the companies don't trust, and that was mentioned earlier in this, obviously, this talk, and because they don't trust the vendors themselves, they impose a very hefty or difficult process to obtain that trust in the way procurement is carried out. Though realistically, procurement, or that trust is based on two variables, not just one: risk and value associated with that risk. So if you're procuring a vendor product that is, I don't know, £10 million worth of licenses and takes 6 months to migrate from your existing system into that, then there's two aspects. First of all is the risk that it goes wrong. And if it does go wrong, what happens if it does go wrong? So people put cotton wool around themselves by imposing quite difficult or tedious processes, which in itself actually costs the vendors quite a lot of cash. So the people that can help with that often get put off it, especially certainly in the UK procurement rules. Now, if you think about trying to change that, you could argue the case that, well, requirements themselves can be broken up into thinner verticals. And if you think about that, that means the value at risk of each one is significantly lower, and even if it does have the same probability of going wrong. So if you're suddenly procuring for £10,000 worth of stuff, then actually that's a much easier, it's a different game to betting on 10 million, if that makes sense. So it's the old kind of roulette game. Do you want to live to fight another day by betting all on red with only one chip or multiple? So yeah, that's kind of how I sort of see it. But there's quite a few I can sort of mention. So, yeah, go ahead, Tom.
But Ethar, do you really see that thinly slicing, slicing them into different chunks as a mechanism to? I mean, I understand how it reduces risk, but at the same time, since, especially at least here in the States, governmental procurement isn't, there isn't an economy of scale, and there isn't, so the cost of doing the big one and the cost of doing the little one are relatively similar. Yep. So all we've done is mount in the environment because to do. Trust, though, I think is we all talk about trust and we want trust, but I think we have to fundamentally understand that both parties in the equation probably have different economic objectives. In the end, it may be that there's some degree of overlap in terms of satisfying a need from the business side and satisfying the customer from the sourcey side, but at the same time they're both attempting to maximize the value that they're delivering to their stockholders.
Yeah.
And that's not delivering, and sometimes that's value, sometimes that's functionality, but a lot of times that's just flat out money and profit.
Yeah.
That's the trust barrier that I see. That's why, especially with these big things, right? That's why I think it's involved, because people are afraid. Here in the States, if you get a procurement wrong and you do it really wrong, somebody's going to look for your, not only look for your job, but attempt to, throw you in prison, perhaps, kind of stuff. as doing, being illegal. All of these things are barriers to trust. Obviously, small things, measuring the right things, all are good things that we all agree on, I think.
Yes.
But I don't necessarily know that procurement folks and then politicians, at least in the side of governmental procurement, would agree to that.
Yeah, I think there's an element which is correct in what you stated there, especially around the larger elements of procurement and how they prefer to bunch that sort of stuff up, if that makes sense. It's one thing to them. But being realistic, thinly slicing stuff actually does reduce the risk around it, because if you look at projects that were run in the past, a lot of smaller projects tend to deliver much better than one very large one, because the risk associated with the probability, if you like, of it going wrong, even if the costs are the same, is different. But I think you're absolutely right. The procurement people don't really understand the end-to-end value in that. Certainly I found that anyway, and that does leave you in a situation where, because they don't really get it, and in fact sometimes in some organizations the delegated authority of cash, so say £10,000 worth of spend is delegated to the department, and anything over that has to be finance approved. That sort of thing also leaves these really small scale pieces of work outside their domain altogether, and that means they never even see it. So I think there's definitely elements that, and I to absolutely agree with you on the point of trust, because the economic objectives, if they're not aligned, you will get that situation where the economic objectives of one person is going sort of horizontally, if you like, and the economic objective of the other people is going vertically. So it's perpendicular to one another. That's a disaster. So yeah, absolutely.
Gregor, Casimir?
Yeah.
A question here: is it all about money when negotiation?
Definitely not in so looking at some statistics on what makes at least IT customers happy. This year, the last thing on the bottom during delivery was the cost. Actually, the quality of the delivery and the relationships between the key people were way more important than the cost. But of course, first, then you have to pass the. So you negotiate about money, but it's not money that will make you happy in the delivery.
Gregor, is that where in the organization is that true? I would suspect that might be true at the C-level of an organization, but I would strongly suspect that someone would very closely manage and grade a project manager if they missed on time or they missed on cost. And that what you're describing, I think, is probably true, but I think it's probably different where you are.
I think you're right in a way. So I've been in a situation where we offered something to the customer at a very, very good price and very high quality, and someone else offered something at half the price and obviously not very high quality. And then the, let's say, lower level manager said, well, the regulations are I have to pick the cheaper one because it's 50% off your price. I know it's not going to be as good. I know it's not going to be nearly as good, but I have to pick it as the cheapest one. So.
So do you think that's a problem in the way it's measured in that particular sense? That seems very much like a biometric, a prime example of that.
Is there a huge difference between public tenders and private-to-private contracts?
So my last example was private-to-private example.
But that's often the most economically advantageous style tenders. No, sorry, that's not often the most economically advantageous tenders. That's often the lowest financial price, if you like. And I think that's part of the problem certainly as I see it, because a lot of organizations used to procure that way, didn't they? I think, but certainly in the UK, they've tried to move to the most economically advantageous tenders now, where they do have a quality score. But even then, I'm not entirely sure they've got the right quality factors, if you like, involved in that. I don't know what everybody else's experience of that is.
Ethar, how are they defining quality in that circumstance?
Precisely. In that particular case, exactly. It really totally depends on the individual tender. So what they will do is they'll look at the requirements, decide as a multivariate whether or not it does match on a standard Likert scale the requirement well, badly, not at all, etc. Score on 5, and then they'll have some weighting associated with it. So it's a weighted factor model, and then you multiply one by the other and just sum the results, and that gives you a quality score. And then you have a ratio, if you like, of what your tender value is relative to the lowest priced tender, and then they combine the two in some form, either as a product or as a sum. So yeah.
The problem with that kind of evaluation is that, let's say you have 10 areas where you rate the quality from 0 to 5. Mm-hmm. So the maximum score would be 50. And then the minimum score would be 0. And then let's say you rate the price from 0 to 50. So the highest price would be 50, and the lowest would be, the lowest price would be 0, and the highest price would be 0. Then, of course, the best you can get is 100 evaluation score, and the worst you can get is a 0 evaluation score. And the thing is that people will get automatically, as Ethar described, the 0s and the 50s assigned. But for the quality score, the raters are going to give out 3s and 4s and the occasional 5s. They're never going to give anyone, 5 on all areas, and they're never going to give anyone 0s on all areas, because then they wouldn't even have been invited to participate in the tender. So the effective range is maybe between 35 and 45. So you have. And that means that you're only using a fifth of the quality scale compared to 100% of the price scale, which means that as some experts say, you might as well just don't bother with the quality scale.
Oh yeah, I mean, you really wouldn't. I mean, you could easily run a Monte Carlo analysis against that, assuming that range and assuming some degree of variability, and come up with a high probability of where they would score anyway.
Yeah, precisely. It literally does become a chance exercise sometimes, and I think that's part of the difficulty with this. A lot of the metrics that are useful, I think it goes back to Akov's saying actually, which is that, if you recall, people don't know what to measure. They'll settle for what they can measure, basically, and from that perspective, they just kind of specify quality scores, which can be somewhat arbitrary, I've found, especially where you get a situation where the requirements state one thing, the quality, and they focus on it a lot within the tender itself, but then they score it with a very low weighting, which then kind of leaves you in this situation where the actual tender itself is somewhat inconsistent. So I think there's a lot of that goes on, and certainly from our perspective, when we see something like that, we often deliberately pull out, because we've got a situation where actually it might not be worth us putting the effort in to bid for something like that if the actual the tender itself is that inconsistent. What's the work going to be like? So sometimes we choose ourselves the most economically advantageous way is just to not participate in the first place, find something else, because it doesn't cost us zero to do these exercises. Yeah, that's the thing. So.
How can you write the contracts for innovation or creativity?
Who wants to field this one? I'm quite happy to pick it up enough. Yeah, I mean, certainly from our perspective, we write them again precisely on the well, there's two aspects to it. Part of it is stuff we already do know, in which case we use what's called in the agile space consumer-driven contracts. I'm sure you guys are familiar with it, where you basically write what is effectively an acceptance test, and everybody always aims for that. And that acceptance test includes examples within it. So we try to understand exactly what that is. If we can't write it at the beginning, we give the format and the expectation. And what we do is we say, this is your budget. That's what you've stated that you want to pay. And you've got to understand that we don't know what we want. And in fact, you guys don't know what you want, in a very sugared pill, if that makes any sense. And then we state, okay, but we accept the specification, if you like, or the requirements in this format. So we'll either help you write them or we'll ask you for them. And we'll ask you to provide those to us, and we'll check it into our repos if you like, and then pull it out and code against those acceptance criteria and nothing more. Now, when it comes to innovation, that's obviously slightly more complicated. Because from that perspective, nobody knows exactly what they want. They want something innovative, but actually the nature of tenders themselves mean that it's difficult to allow them to be innovative, because the actual tender process itself isn't very innovative. So you've got to put
let's talk about the, innovation clauses.
Yeah.
Because every major contract has an innovation clause.
Precisely. Yeah.
What does that mean to you, Tom?
Yeah, from our perspective, it's very difficult because when you have an innovation clause, believe it or not, sometimes we've even said to people, well, actually, part and parcel of this innovation might be to rethink the way you tender stuff, because that's a freebie we often give out to them, because realistically, sometimes they've got themselves into a bit of a mess as far as the tender itself is concerned. But what we tend to do is you can't measure that, because of course you can be quite innovative, but you don't know how the market's going to take it. If you don't have control of how you present to the market, then of course you don't know what the end-to-end value or alignment with the customer's needs actually are. So that becomes a very difficult exercise. So from our perspective, what we tend to do is try to, as much as possible, give them the flexibility to work with it, but they have to understand that what they may get may not be valuable to them. And that's often a very, very, very difficult sell, and procurement will not buy that in the vast majority of cases. So,
Yeah, I tend to agree with Ethar on that. And in the States, at least, more times than not, innovation clauses, innovation pieces tend to be carved out separately. If work is going out as innovation work, it tends to be farmed out to a far smaller pool. It tends not to be put out to bid. It tends to be put into a pool where there is a significantly higher trust level. And most of that's T&M kind of work. Investigation, looking for a drug. I mean, the answer is you don't know what you're going to get. Albeit when people are attempting to do that at the same time in systems, right? They're attempting to do a piece of known work and a piece of unknown work. Those two things tend to be carved out separately with separate clauses and separate measurements. You can look at a piece of work to deliver a commercial off-the-shelf kind of product, all known, right, or relatively well known. Obviously, you're still going to have trouble. But if you're going to then, on top of that, take and rewrite the entire business processes, which is going to be much more innovative, that'll tend to be carved out separately, and the feedback loops for that will be fundamentally smaller, so that people will know where it's at and whether they're going to get value for that. So one of the things that we suggest and very strongly stand on is that when the outcome is the thing that's unknown, roughly that feedback loop has got to be fundamentally smaller, and every feedback loop, every time you go through that loop, you have to have an out, and both sides can blow it up at the end of every feedback loop, or at the end of every X number of feedback loops. It depends if you're doing safe or something like that. It might be 4 or 5, but you have to have an out, and everyone. It's like the old Toyota production line, right? So everyone gets to pull the chain and say the line stops, and that way you help build in some of that trust into that contract.
I think that's an excellent way to go about it, to be fair. And the difficulty we've got in the UK is that, especially in public procurement, they tend to try to tie in innovation into the main tender. Though realistically, I really, really like the way they do it in the US, precisely because of that. It does get farmed off. It's a different type of contract. T&M is perfect for that sort of exercise. As long as there's value delivered and there's some way of assessing that value, then actually that's a perfect way of going about it. Because tying it into what is effectively a fixed price contract.
It goes back in agile.
Yeah, very much so. Absolutely, yeah.
But there's of course the innovation that kind of external innovation, new products, or new ways of presenting products and so on. But there's also the kind of relentless improvements to the delivery as such, improving something every day, every week, every month in the delivery, and making things just a little bit better. One less incident per hour, or
we don't approach that as innovation.
Right?
We don't approach that as innovation. We generally, and the contracts that I've definitely been involved in, tend not to look at that as innovation. That's table stakes into the game of outsourcing. And having been on many bid teams and as an advisor to very large integrators, most of them look at that as, that's unfortunately where the lawyers and the bid team who probably haven't delivered a day in their life get involved in writing those contracts. And you see deals that say you will have a 10% productivity gain across every year of this contract. And if you don't, here's the mock penalties kind of thing that goes along with that. That in at least a lot of the outsourcing world, that's not innovation, that's table stakes. The intent is to drive down the cost of that contract, whether that's innovation because the outsourcer figures out how to do the work better, or they find a different mechanism to source that so that the workers cost less. That's an unknown. And I don't know that that the people writing that deal always care whether that's innovation or price compression.
Cost accounting, absolutely, yes, very much so. Yeah, and that's part of the difficulty, because if your cost accounting is actually tied into the value you deliver, it's the old adage where if you fire all the rowers because you're trying to reduce the cost, where's your boat going? And so at the end of the day, I think that's part of the difficulty, very much so.
If you fire and buy a 50. But if you fire all the rowers and buy a 50 horsepower engine,
yes,
then
precisely, exactly, absolutely, very much so. Indeed. So, but that again is a purchase, not a cost. Well, not the standard kind of cost of camera, very much so. And that's the key point, because I think everything has to have a return on that, if in a way. Well, it's the rate of return of each individual, let's say, it's thin sliver of work or delivery or innovative piece. Versus just the cost of everything, because actually the cost of it may very well be tied into the value that you get, and if it is, then you cut the cost, you will cut the value. It's the nature of these non-linear systems, I think. So yeah, very much so.
Well, it's all the famous S curves, I think. Usually, if you don't invest anything, you don't get anything, but if you invest too much, you don't get any additional benefits.
Precisely, yeah, exactly. Right.
What about digital transformation? Does that have an impact of how you write contracts? Gregor, what's your thoughts? You're working a lot with that now.
Digital transformation. So digital transformation is a very tricky topic, because it tends to mean something to everyone. What's your definition then, before we talk about it?
Good answer.
Ethar, what's the opinion in UK?
Yes. Nice. Well, the thing is, realistically, digital transformation, I don't think has one guise. At the end of the day, companies may be traditional and they may transform into a digital organization for one reason or another. So there are, for example, catalog shops that we have here. So the old style 80s catalog where you flick through it and find the wheelbarrow that you've always wanted, and then you purchase it. Those sort of environments moving online, and they often provide their products as credit products or in association with credit products. So buy it 3 months at XYZ percentage. And that's one type of transformation you might get. And then you'll have other situations where you've got an existing digital infrastructure, of course, just going back to the previous conversation, and then they'll want to transform the way they do that. And that to make it more optimal or encompass more information to make decisions easier or better, etc. I think that it's such a vague term at this moment in time. It almost sounds like a bit of a marketing term in a lot of ways, and I think that's, in a way, well, pretty much the most difficult thing to pin down. If somebody says to you, here's a contract, I want to digitally transform our enterprise. How? What does it mean? What am I measured on? What value could you get out of this? So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I would be at a loss. If someone put a contract down on a table and said, "Tom, we want your organization to digitally transform us," what is, again? I think we go back to Gregor's comment.
Yeah.
What does that mean? I mean, unless whatever contract we're writing, whether it's digital transformation, whether it's building brick and mortar store, or doing assembler coding, the answer is, if we don't define what we're going to do, or at least some endpoint as to what that means, can't write it, and there is, it's that nebulous. You need to get yourself a lawyer, because you're going to go to court sooner or later. Even if everybody is just really feels that that's the right answer, at some point you're going to end up at loggerheads.
I think so. So do you think the definition of done is important in that scenario? So
the definition of done is always important. I think it's
extremely, absolutely.
Not just from a contract perspective, but actually from personal satisfaction of having done your job, but also on having the right definition of done that allows you to take the risk you want to take in saying that something is done. So it's not overdone and not underdone.
Just right, the Goldilocks syndrome.
Would you translate done differently if we use the word success?
So we're talking about success criteria or acceptance criteria. I think I would probably define them the same, but somebody's got to define the success for done. I think for me, that's the way I see it, because I can imagine a situation where if you're misaligned, someone's definition of done is I've moved this piece of paper from my in tray to my out tray, but that's not necessarily successful or acceptable for the overall organization. So that's the way I'd see it. Good question.
So I see the word success more in sort of a systems thinking point of view. What is it? What is the overall transformation? What is it that we want to take, the start point and end up with for a client, and that transformation? Whereas done can translate into any number of tactical steps within there. So I agree. I think we have to define done, but maybe success is another one of those things that we have to have in the contract, because that then defines or gets us closer to what is it that somebody really wants, and not just a list of requirements or a list of bullet points that get put in solve. And if we can get that in there, if we start to deviate from those bullet points because they don't get us towards success, then we don't have to rewrite the contract per se.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Definitely agree with that. And certainly that's the approach we've taken when it comes to contracts. We have lean contracts, if you like. Our main aim is to define success criteria at the end of the day. How we get there is up to us at the end. So we don't have the situation where the done in between steps become important, but that's the natural position of most milestones. They're often in between steps. They're not quite the end thing. And I think that certainly for us is the impetus for us to change the way we do contracts. From our perspective, we like to have acceptance criteria so we can take whichever route is needed. So if we do need to work with a different team to help facilitate the flow of work across the enterprise, we will do that, because that is allowed within our acceptance criteria. It's up to us how we do it, part of the trust again. And then the success criteria is what we get measured against. So yeah, definitely agree with that. What about yourself, Gregor?
Yeah.
So if I go back to my contract from we talked about in the beginning, there were no success criterias.
No.
Well,
that
there were no
one
obligations
thing
anyway,
should be added.
So if there are no obligations, why should there be success criteria?
Why should the contract exist?
How would that work?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But it's a gold mine of contracting. But I'm sure that there are many of these, and maybe it's interesting to think about the processes that cause good people to kind of deviate from the good path. You know, everyone is a smart person and doing their very best to do their job, but somehow the system that we are all acting in is gamed, so that doesn't always lead to good outcomes.
I think certainly part of it is that there are players involved that again, I think they have different economic goals. I also don't think that they have what is possible in the new way of doing work with software, especially in the software world. You know, what is it that's truly possible now that 10, 15 years ago, when we were writing contracts for systems that would be delivered in 5 years, we wouldn't have even considered interim deliverables or things like that, or other feedback models. And that's where those people were trained. So I agree with you that they are doing probably the best job they can. Some of them are doing the best job they can within rules, regulations, whether it's governmental or industrial, association, that they're not going to be able to break out of. So they're caught until we can convince our political masters to change how that kind of stuff happens. But on a commercial level, I think a lot of that boils down to people aren't aware of what's possible. They haven't been given an easy way to do this. And while there isn't a perfect example, there ought to be some set of examples that would allow them, from an analogy point of view, to say, hey, this is a lot like, and then we can move forward. At least, we would have been able to shortcut the one that Casimir's friend got, that was, crazy talk.
Yeah, definitely. I absolutely echo every word of that. So absolutely. And I think that part of the difficulty is the fact that when people get into a particular role, there's always three things. The first one is the fact that there's them, there's the systemic next step or previous step, and there's the system as a whole, which gives this. So there's three parts to it. There's two entities and one dynamic, if you like. And I think that definitely does become a bit of a mishmash, where people have over the years pushed forces into other parts of the business. So one department wants something in a particular way, that means the supplying department ends up providing in a particular way. They don't know why they're doing it because they've always done it that way, and that becomes an interesting sort of argument as to how you can systemically optimize the process as a whole. And actually, it's often quite easy to as an enterprise architect, certainly, to go and find this stuff, because you just literally put the marble in at the top and literally just follow where that marble goes. That's all points. So it's a bit of a marble.
I've seen that game before.
Yeah, funny enough, exactly. Yeah, exactly. But literally just walk the floor and just kind of see where that piece of work goes. Because what you often see is people who are in their little, I don't want to use the word in a kind of derogatory way, but people who are in their silo, in their zones, don't really understand the total reason why they do the thing end to end. And we've probably seen this in IT and systems as well, where actually one system has a bug, so they fix it in the consuming system, which then creates this really weird situation where they decide to then change this consuming system, then say, oh, we do it this way because of X, Y, Z, and then they've tested it in isolation, right? Then when they connect it to the rest of the system, it suddenly doesn't work because the bug was fixed in the consuming system, not in the main one. And that creates a really, really weird coupling where actually you're promoting wrong behavior within systems. And the same can be true of people, we say. So I think that's certainly one major factor within that process.
So-called workarounds, yes.
Yeah.
So maybe it's time to start to wrap up. We had a 45-minute, very interesting discussion.
I have a question to Ethar. A little bit talked about what he talked about earlier. It's about splitting things down and the trust. If I make a contract for 1 million euros, then, well, I need to have a certain level of trust to do that with that vendor.
Yeah.
But if I have a 10 million euro contract or 25 million euro contract, that trust is rather hard to get.
Yeah, yeah.
How should we solve this?
Yeah, but remember why trust is needed. Trust is in the 1 million versus 10 million scenarios. How can I describe it? Trust is, or well, the lack of trust is indicative or implied by the level of contract paperwork that you go through. So in the case of the European rules, for example, for procurement, you go through a PQQ process for anything over about 170,000 euros, and then you go through the main ITT process. So there's two sets of paperwork there. The same is often true when you procure in large organizations, and that's why you have finance departments that want to authorize anything over whatever the delegated authority will actually be. So the reality is, when you look at requirements, though, there might be 300 or 400 of them, and each one of them is a tiny thin vertical. You think to yourself, okay, what do you actually want with this? And if you can get it into a position where it describes that vertical, usually a primary scenario, something that travels end to end, that is often actually quite cheap. The cost in most IT systems is not the primary scenarios, often the secondary ones, where there may be 100, 200, 300 of these. But at the same time, each one of those delivers only a thin sliver of value compared to the primary scenario, which we assume to be 80% of the value, or whatever number it might be. So with that in mind, if you're delivering primary scenarios then all the time, then actually that becomes a nice, easy way, if you like, of segmenting the work. But it has to be end to end. It can't just be part of an overall solution, because then you get this potential for different economies or economic advantages to exist. So certainly from my perspective, the way I tend to prefer is to look at the primary scenarios first, because they're the most valuable ones. And then after that, after you've delivered all those, possibly in a delegated authority sort of way. So often a lot of these primary scenarios come in at less than 10K. So you can just start delivering all those, possibly through multiple vendors, believe it or not, because it's still, from the European perspective, a competitive tendering process. All you're doing is saying, okay, we have 10 people expressed an interest in this tender. So what we'll do is we'll give each of them, say, $1,500, right? And we'll say, just do this one thin sliver of primary scenario, each one of them. Now, what you then do is whittle it down by the quality of the work that they actually deliver. That makes sense. So what that then gives you is that the people who are better at it get more and more of the requirement as you go along. It's still competitive, but all you're doing is doing the typical Toyota production system, or in fact most Japanese production systems, and taking the work away from people who do it badly. Does that make sense? So that's one way that can be done. I've introduced that into a couple, one organization, major organization in the Northeast, and then oddly enough, the BBC seemed to have procured one particular tender that way as well, and it still technically counts as a competitive tender. So hence, it's not breaking any other rules. That makes sense. So that's one way.
So this is a reality show.
Funny enough, yeah, exactly. It's to some degree, absolutely.
Like Paradise Hotel.
Yeah, exactly. Very much so. So yeah, but from our perspective, that's just the way it's often it can be broken down into. Because if the delegated authority, if you think about it, trust exists because of the lack of trust it implies the paperwork. So if you introduce trust or reduce the impact of what happens when things go wrong, so 1,500 quid, they wouldn't spare that. Frankly, most people. It takes more to deal with the paperwork than £1,500 worth of work that comes in. So with that in mind, that's one way of streamlining everything. So often a lot of procurement can be reduced down to a page or even half a page and an automated acceptance criteria in the case of IT. So we've used that mechanism to allow organizations who are interested to deliver on that. That makes sense. That's one way of doing it.
So if we have a contract with a clearly defined success criteria and very well aware of the risks, then we don't need a big contract.
But you don't. Yeah, you definitely don't need a big one. But here's the thing: if you're aware of the risks, that's one thing. But actually, here's the thing: what happens if you spin a coin at the spin a, I don't know, a pound coin, and the most you're going to lose is that £1 coin? I wouldn't worry so much about it. If you spun the coin and you lost a house, or you spun the coin and lost a company, that's a different game, and that's really the second variable there. It's risk and sensitivity combined as one thing in terms of risk. So if actually it doesn't matter if you lose 1,500 quid, that's fine, because trust me, if you go down a £12 billion program and you find that actually £10 billion in that it's not going to work, that's a bit late. It's more than a pound. So I'd be a little less sort of inclined to worry about that small amount by comparison. But it's something that has to be understood, because as part of the organization or the enterprise as a whole, that has to be an optimization process as well. So try to reduce the amount of those.
And then after 10 billions, when you find out it's not going to work, then that's when the blame game starts.
Precisely. It may even start before then, but absolutely, yes, very much so. So, and then it's back to the lawyers again. So back to Tom's parents. So. Excellent. Okay. Right.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Any final comment from you, Tom?
No, this has been fantastic. There's very little that I could argue with in that last exchange. So I actually took some notes, because very frankly, this trust relationship to contract provisions per se is a testable hypothesis.
Very much so. Absolutely. Very much.
So I was thinking of diving, and especially cave diving.
Okay.
Because there was a very interesting documentary on the Swedish television a month ago.
Mm.
And that is really dangerous, and you need to trust the other guys with your life.
Mm.
Yeah.
They
don't write any contracts.
Exactly.
They have a code, I'm sure, code of honor, and that is an oral, implicit contract, but they live by it. So about contracts, a fundamental contract in society, is that we use the same letter forms when we write letters. And the alphabet was invented several thousand years ago, and we're still using it, slightly modified, but it's the same alphabet. It's the A is still an ox, and so on, Aleph, Alf, and someone said in a discussion to me a few days ago that it's arbitrary. There is no contract, but it's a social contract. It's not arbitrary the way you write letters. You can't invent your own, because no one is going to be able to read it. So just because you don't think there is a contract doesn't mean that there isn't a contract.
But if we look at the cave diving contract in particular, if you like, it's a good example. The idea is it's a social contract, and everybody is aligned to that contract, that social dynamic, that trust. I think I think it's a good example for this discussion. I'd say. Yeah.
But that only works where you're operating within a group that release that social contract. Once you step outside of a group that will allow deviation from that social contract, then it isn't, right? Then there's no way to communicate that exists. So if you took a bunch of tourists cave diving, and there was that sort of that social contract of leave no person behind, make sure everybody doesn't get stuck, all of those important things, then you would need something much more explicit, or those folks that weren't part of that group within that social boundary wouldn't feel held to that contract.
Well, I have a rather pragmatic approach to this. Mm-hmm. When I'm diving in groups with people I don't know, I don't trust them until 5 dives.
Okay.
And that would be fair. Absolutely.
But that's part of the organizational culture, though, isn't it, as well? So I agree.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's kind of game theory, 101, tit for tat.
Yeah.
Very instantly.
So we're running up on the hour. Thank you very much for participating. Please hang on, but I'll stop the live cast.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thanks.